The Information Regulator of South Africa says it's analyzing the revised WhatsApp privacy policy to assess whether its terms of service are in compliance with the Protection of Personal Information Act in the country. Chairperson of the Information Regulator, Advocate Penzi Tlakula, says the new WhatsApp policy will have to be approved.
We have been informed that Facebook is in discussions with the regulator in Ireland, which is the Irish Data Protection Authority, which is responsible for Facebook. And the reports say that it is unlikely that Facebook will introduce this policy without them reaching some agreement with the Irish regulator. So that's very interesting. And I guess that's because of the GDPR, which is the data protection law that applies in Europe. That being the case, if they can negotiate with the authority in Ireland, which they are accountable to, what gives them, and if media reports are indeed correct, what gives them the audacity to think that in our country and other parts of the world, they can indeed introduce a policy without talking to the regulator of the country. In particular, in this instance, we are talking about South Africa, because our law here, the Protection of Personal Information laws, is modeled on the GDPR. So what we are doing at the moment, we are saying to them, okay, give us that policy that applies to Europe. Let's look at the difference between the two policies. Secondly, we'll then analyze the policy that applies to users outside Europe and see whether that policy is in line with the Protection of Personal Information Act. So that's where we are. We are doing that analysis. But what I've said is quite curious and quite concerning, if media reports are correct, that there is a different treatment for users in Europe and users outside Europe.
Tlakula has, however, warned that Facebook will have to comply with the law in the country in order for the new policy to be implemented.
We have a law here that lays down the conditions for lawful processing of personal information. Anyone who processes personal information has to comply with the conditions that are in the law. One of those conditions is that if you collect information with my consent, if you're going to process it further, then the further processing has to be in line with the original purpose for which you collected that information. And you need to get my consent to further process that information. So what WhatsApp has collected our personal information, and we gave consent, but for them to further process that information, to share it with Facebook, they then have to get our consent, because that's what the law says. And these are issues that we are looking at. We're going to analyze to see whether the 8 conditions for lawful processing of personal information are complied with by that revised policy of previous policy of the 4th of January.
Right now, for more on this, we talk now to social media law expert Diana Schwartz. Diana, it's good to have you with us on the newsfeed late night. Considering that the data sharing practice of WhatsApp with Facebook is something that has been on since 2016, is this an extreme private policy change to warrant the level of backlash that this has been receiving?
I wouldn't say it's extreme. However, what is good about it is that now we are seeing certain additional provisions that do look at privacy in particular and interactions with business, and people being updated and being alerted as to this are now increasingly becoming aware of what has actually been happening with the collection of their information, and what further provisions WhatsApp has put in place to share information with the other Facebook companies.
Yeah. Is this an erosion, would you say, of the original promise that WhatsApp made to its users before the Facebook takeover?
I would think that is quite a double-edged sword question. Yes and no. So WhatsApp has remained faithful to the encryption on its messaging. There is still the end-to-end encryption, which protects the actual WhatsApp messages and calls between users. However, this further sharing of information across all Facebook companies and products could be said as an erosion, because all these Facebook controlled companies are now sharing information between themselves and with third parties who they are affiliated with and to whom they use to provide further services.
So what sort of information has WhatsApp been sharing with Facebook up until this point?
So up until this point, the usual information has been shared on your account information, your phone number, collection things on your devices, things like your location, all of those things have been shared, as well as how you interact with third parties, with other users. And now what's being introduced is how you're going to be interacting with businesses. And also what is a little bit alarming when it comes to that is transactions with regard to payments, etc., for business and account information details.
Yeah. Will it only be limited to the user's interaction with business? Or, for example, will media that is on your WhatsApp, personal communications, private chats, will that also be shared with Facebook?
No, predominantly no, but there are certain exceptions in the privacy policy that allows for that to happen. So, for example, if you have, you need to use the customer support, and then you would have to send screenshots of your messages with the person you may be having an issue with, or there's perhaps a violation or a social media offense that has occurred, like cyberbullying or something like that, that information will then be stored by them. And they say that they use this information in terms of how they provide customer support. So there are a lot of gray areas in the actual terms and conditions when you go into them and the privacy policy and you read them very carefully from start to finish. There are some gray areas, and a lot of those areas do not actually comply with the Protection of Personal Information Act. And so I think Facebook and WhatsApp in particular are going to really have to be to review the policies, as the Information Regulator has said, in order to bring them in line with those 8 principles of POPI compliance.
Now, like the regulator, Advocate Pensik Tlakula, I've also read online, I don't know how true this is, that this policy does not apply in the EU. How true is that?
That is correct. So we don't know exactly what, having had sight of the EU policies, but the EU regions are subject to the GDPR, as she said earlier, the General Data Protection Regulations, which are, throughout the European Union. And in South Africa, they don't apply to us, but we have POPI. So she is quite right in saying that whatever policies and consents are needed from the Information Regulator, and compliance with POPI has to take place in this country as well. And definitely consultation and consent needs to be gained in order to protect South African personal information. There is a difference, and that difference, it might be slight differences, or it might be a huge difference in terms of how things look. However, what she says is correct. We need to have equal application of our laws, whether it's in the European Union or South Africa.
Yeah. Is there a space for the regulator to intervene here? And I suppose they are the right organization or the right institution to intervene here. Because here's what happened sometime earlier in 2020. I'm sure you did, I did. We all received this message. It was irritating. We wanted to get rid of it, to say, yeah, sure. Let's just continue because I want to use the app, which means I have now agreed to this new policy, essentially. Can they intervene at this point?
They can intervene. The main purpose and function of the Information Regulator is to ensure that the protection of personal information of South Africans, as enshrined in POPI, is carried out, and that it is accountable to the law. And those principles involve openness, involve consent, involve being notified of how our personal information is stored, processed, what the purpose of collecting that information is, and also having security safeguards in place, etc., to protect that personal information. So WhatsApp and Facebook cannot just collect information for their purposes if it does not align with the laws in our country.
Right. Now we've seen many in South Africa moving to the other free encrypted messaging services. I don't know if you've had a browse at those privacy policies, and how different are they to what WhatsApp is offering at the moment?
So yes, we have. We've looked in depth at the Telegram app and the Signal app, which are the apps that most people are migrating to. In terms of our advice at Diana Schwartz Attorneys, we would advise that Signal is a much better option. It's also end-to-end encryption on messaging and calls, and basically in their terms and conditions and their policies, they do not monetize and share personal information. The only pitfall when it comes to a Signal, like WhatsApp as well, is that jurisdiction-wise it can be tricky, whereas if we have a claim against Signal, we would then have to launch that claim in the United States, but that's not dissimilar from WhatsApp at the moment. So when it comes to Telegram, unfortunately, we advise against it, especially for children and adults alike, because the default settings are all very open. You can basically be contacted by non-contacts or people who don't have your mobile numbers. You could be invited to groups or exposed to certain harmful content without having asked for that as well. So we at Diana Schwartz Attorneys advise, if you're looking for a good move, we would definitely advise moving to Signal, but not to Telegram. And Signal seems to be, gets the 2 thumbs up from us, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, they might not be monetizing at the moment, but what's to say that once people migrate and they're seeing the database growing, they might want to consider that, and would they be within their right to do so?
As their terms and conditions and their policy stand now, no. So if Signal were to monetize and also try to make money off personal information and data sharing, etc., they would then have to reintroduce new policies or amendments, as WhatsApp is doing now, and they wouldn't be able to get away with it without the consent or updating, and then that would of course alert the public. So if it is something that happens in the future, we can be mindful of it, and we can be rest assured that we do have the laws to protect us, as what is happening now with Poppy and the Information Regulator.
I was social media expert Diana Schwartz. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much for joining us on the Newsfeed Late Night.